Hello and welcome, I'm your Code Monkey. There's a really interesting discussion happening right now on the topic of stop killing games. For context, this is an initiative being proposed in the EU that is currently gathering signatures. The goal with this initiative is, like the name implies, to stop killing games, so make sure the games don't die. The main example they talk about is the game The Crew. This was a game made by Ubisoft and launched in 2014. It's a game that had both single player and multiplayer elements, and earlier this year Ubisoft shut down the game's servers, and in doing so the game is now completely unplayable. So if you bought the game before, you cannot play it, not even in single player, the game is just gone for good. So the main goal with this initiative is to make sure that doesn't happen, to make sure you can keep playing the games you bought for as long as you want to. Meaning this would require companies, in this case Ubisoft, to leave the game in a playable state, either by removing all the online checks with a patch, or by providing server binaries so people can run their own servers. Now importantly, this does not seek to acquire ownership of the games, any IP and anything like that. It also does not expect the publisher to provide resources for the video game once they discontinue it, so the whole goal is really leaving it in a reasonable, functional state. That's really the general idea. And on this, there's been a lot of discussion, arguing both for and against this initiative. On the for side, the channel Accursed Farms, led by Ross, is the main one behind it. On the against side, the main voice against it is Thor from Pirate Software. Then Primeagen also feels this would cause more harm than good. And Louis Rossman also has a very interesting video on this subject. He has a unique take given how he was a big driving force behind the Right to Repair bill, so he knows something about the process of proposing something to eventually become law, even though that was in the US and Stop Killing Games is in the EU. And of course there's the official website, which also has a really nice FAQ with tons of questions answered, as well as the official initiative website, which has a bunch more detail. Which, by the way, this is actually really small. When I heard about it, I thought this was going to be like 80 pages of something, but no, it literally is just 3 sentences long. So you can read through this entire thing, read through the entire FAQ and everything. You can read all that in just a few minutes. Here I want to share my thoughts on this, but definitely also go ahead and research it for yourself. Go read these pages and watch all those videos to get the full context. I'll link to everything in the description. Now I myself have been a professional solo indie game developer for 10 years now. I've got 9 games published on Steam, so I feel I can talk a little bit about this topic. But at the same time, I don't really have any experience with like MMOs, live service games, and those kinds of things. My games are really solo games developed by a solo developer, so very tiny, small games. So definitely keep that in mind, keep in mind my own perspective as you hear my thoughts. Now like I said, there's a lot of discussion happening right now. There's some valid counterarguments and some less valid ones. One thing that kickstarted this whole discussion is especially because Thor has a huge audience and he came out so strongly against it. Now because of that, some people are attacking him, calling him greedy or out of touch or biased because he's the director of marketing for a publisher. I really don't think that's right. I think he genuinely does want what's best for the industry, and he genuinely does think that this will not be a positive. I just think that both him and Prime, they are both too hyper-focused on specific hypothetical scenarios where things could go wrong, and they are completely ignoring all of the other much more likely scenarios where this actually becomes a positive change. There's also one very important factor that I feel is being lost in this discourse. It is how this is not a law proposal. The initiative is literally just these 3 sentences. That's really it. So the goal with this is really just to get the conversation started. It is not meant to make just these 3 sentences into law. If that were the case, then yeah, I would agree this is way too vague and needs to be a lot more detailed. But again, the goal is really just for this to start the conversation. You can see the official website for the European Citizens Initiative. You can go ahead and see how it all works. So first, get started, start by launching an initiative, then get it registered. Finally, try to get support, so try to get 1 million citizens. This is the current stage where it's at right now. Then after that, it's going to make sure that all of those votes have been verified, then submit it officially. After that, get an answer, then start talking with a bunch of representatives to explain all the issues in detail. And finally, after all of that, if the Commission considers legislation as an appropriate response to your initiative, it will start preparing a formal proposal. Then this can require preparatory steps like public consultations, impact assessments, and so on. So this is very much just the first step to start the conversation. It does not mean this whole thing, this tiny thing, this is the entire law. In reality, this is exactly like game development. Whenever you design a game, you never really get it right the first time. You build some kind of system, then you define some values, and then crucially, you playtest the game over and over again and constantly iterate upon it. So that is literally the exact same process that we have here. So this initiative is pretty much just a bare bones prototype, and then if it passes, then it will be iterated upon. After a while, they will make some kind of alpha version, then a beta version, and maybe a few years from now, it will become some kind of final version. Now, there's also a very strange misconception that both Thor and Prime mentioned in their videos. How they think how this is meant to force multiplayer games to be turned into single-player games. Now, if that were the case, I would agree that would be a monumental task. It would be unreasonable to have a law to basically force developers to do that, turning a multiplayer game into a functional single-player game that basically requires re-architecting the entire game, which is really not a reasonable ask. But I've read through the entire initiative, and although I'm not a lawyer, I definitely did not interpret it that way at all. From what I understand, the goal with this initiative is mainly 2 things. So for games that are primarily single-player but with some online features, like The Crew, basically just make sure that the single player portion, that one does not break when the online servers go down. For example, The Crew had a ton of single player content, But now, none of that content is available. You can't play it even if you did purchase the game. You cannot experience any of that right now. And the second thing is for multiplayer games, for those to still be playable after the company ceases support, either by providing the server binaries or some source code. So this proposal is really not requiring developers to make single-player games out of a multiplayer game. I'm really not sure if I'm missing something, but I read through the whole website, all the FAQ, the initiative, and so on, and I really did not interpret it that way at all. So I'm really not sure why they mentioned this as a counter-argument. Then in terms of releasing the multiplayer server binaries, there are indeed some valid arguments against it, like what Prime mentioned with regards to malicious compliance. How it might be that companies will simply release just a thin layer of code, and if you don't have really all of the servers that depend upon to make that work, without all of those then it really won't work. So due to the complexity of multiplayer games nowadays, how they use tons of servers on the cloud with some very complex infrastructure, with all of that, I can't see this being a problem. And how by releasing this thin layer without all of the connections to all the code behind it, that really won't solve the problem. So this is definitely a valid counterpoint, and I really don't know what is the solution for it. Or there are also cases where the server basically depends on some third-party libraries that they do not have the license to distribute, meaning they legally might not be allowed to just send over the server binary. So that would indeed be a problem. In that case, those developers would be breaking the law really through no fault of their own. But like Lewis said in his video, if that isn't the case, then that might actually simply be just a sign that more things need to change. Now for me, I spent my childhood playing Counter-Strike 1.6, and here in Portugal there were no Valve official servers at all. So in order to play with decent ping, Valve basically provide the dedicated server binaries, and then local people or companies like Frag Leader, they could set up their servers and people could play. Then the game just had a server browser and you could connect and play on any server, just connect directly to the IP and that's it, everything works. There's really no need for Valve to be involved at all. At one point I even had my own dedicated server for my clan. We basically just rented a Linux dedicated server on a data center and just ran the Counter-Strike server executable. That option is still valid nowadays. Even though CS 1.6 is no longer supported by Valve themselves, you can still do that. You can still run a server, play the game, connect to it, everything works. Same thing for Quake, Battlefield, Medal of Honor, and really any multiplayer game from the early 2000s. All of those games are still playable nowadays. None of those games have died because none of them are dependent on support from the actual developer. So this initiative is really just proposing turning that into law, so that for example 20 years from now we can play the games from now, just like right now we can play the games from 20 years ago. But again, this initiative would require quite a lot of iteration before it becomes law. So on some games like The Crew, I imagine it would be actually relatively simple to keep the game alive, at least for the single player portion. I imagine it would be relatively straightforward, really just write a wrapper to all the functions that contact the server, and before shutting down the official servers, just update the game, put out one last patch, and make sure to remove that server check. Just do that and at least the single player portion would still work. But then of course there are other games like Microsoft's Flight Simulator. That one is apparently heavily dependent on the cloud to work, so I imagine for that one it would be a much bigger challenge. However, at the same time, if that game was built from the start with an eventual shutdown plan, if so, they would probably be able to build that in such a way that it would be relatively straightforward. Instead of streaming all data from the cloud, they could just include all that map data directly in the game. Naturally, that would have the downside of the game being absolutely massive since it would not depend on the cloud. So it would suck to have such a huge game, but at least it would be playable. If they started development right from the start with this idea in mind, if so, then technically it wouldn't be a big problem. Whereas of course, forcing retroactive changes, that would be a big issue. That would be essentially re-architecting the entire game, so that would not be a good thing. But from what I understand, these laws are usually not retroactive, so it would only apply to games releasing in the future, and possibly a few years after the law actually comes to pass. So this also brings to mind the simple idea of how if you want to make a game, if you make it single player and then afterwards try to make it multiplayer, that is extremely difficult. But if you know you're going to make a multiplayer game, if you make it multiplayer right from the start, then things become much easier. So this over here would really be the exact same thing. It would just require developers to think about a shutdown plan right from the pre-production stage. Then Prime also mentioned an important potential issue regarding piracy and hacking. Basically, if companies are required to expose some kind of protocol, or basically just give out the server binaries, if so, that would indeed give quite a lot of information to potential hackers, so make the hacking problem quite a bit more difficult. But again, the goal with the initiative is while the game is actively being supported, absolutely nothing happens. So this whole thing about exposing some kind of protocol, releasing the server binaries, all of that only happens after the game ends the support. So as long as the company keeps supporting the game, as long as they do that, then there's really no more issues than right now when it comes to piracy or hacking. And afterwards, technically, those could become issues. But the main point of this being that afterwards, even with issues, the game would still be playable. So even if the game died and hackers found easy ways to hack, if so, you could still just download the server binary yourself, build your own server, and just play with your friends. The important thing being, you would be able to play the game. People have also mentioned issues with regards to time licenses, and issues with having to renegotiate that. For example, you can see how the crew had just a handful of users before being shut down, and in order to make the game, they had to license all of these cars, so they had to contact like Lamborghini and Ferrari in order to be able to show the cars in the game, and they probably just had a license to those for about 10 years. So with so few users, it does make sense for them to not renew the license. However, that does not mean that they need to kill the game. Basically, without the license, that just means they would not be able to sell the game anymore, but it should not mean they get to take away the game from people who already own it. That right there is really the wrong part. For example, a game like GTA, they usually have tons of licensed tracks on the radio, and those licenses, those are also timed. If you buy a copy of GTA San Andreas right now, you won't get the same songs that were there at release, but if you have a copy of the game that you bought a long time ago, if so, you can still go play the game with the exact same songs as it had about 20 years ago. Then on his second video, Thor mentioned a scenario where a malicious actor would basically be incentivized to attack some kind of server for a game, attack it with bots, exploits, and really anything. In doing so, it would cost a ton of money for the actual developers, so technically a malicious actor could make the developer go bankrupt, and then if this were law, then that bankrupt developer, they would have to release the source code or the server binaries or anything like that, and then that malicious actor could then take that server, make that server online, and really just profit off of it. So in this scenario, this malicious actor could technically make money off of something that they did not build. Now I think we can all agree that would be a terrible outcome. However, I think the issue with this hypothetical scenario, the issue is basically the assumption that there is only one server, basically only the malicious actor, only that one can provide the server after the developer dies. Meaning that if you want to keep playing the game, you would have to give your money to this malicious actor. But in reality, if this were to happen, if so, there would be dozens or hundreds of regular people just taking the server binaries and just building them. So in this scenario, it would not be limited to just a malicious actor having their own servers. Anyone could make their own server. And if this malicious actor does not have a guarantee of being able to profit off of killing some developer, then that would kind of disincentivize this whole strategy. And in terms of server complexity, people have pointed to an example of World of Warcraft, and how the backend for that game is likely quite complex. But on this, both the initiative and Lewis in his video makes an important distinction about how buying a game is different from renting a game, how when you play WoW, you really have to pay every single month, so in that it is somewhat clear how you're actually renting the game, you're renting access to their servers, and with the assumption with renting any kind of thing is that technically at any point they can stop the rental, so at least that one makes a little bit of sense, regardless of being a good or bad thing. Whereas when you buy a game, kind of like The Crew, you assume you're buying a product, not renting it, so you assume you won't be able to use it many years in the future. So in all, I really do feel like the criticisms against this, they really bring to mind the definition of the saying, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. So yes, I do think there are questions about the specifics. Yes, I do think this will require quite a lot of iteration and a lot more detail before it gets to the unlock stage. But if it doesn't get enough signatures, if so, then it will never get to that stage. So while I do agree that the initiative isn't perfect and doesn't account for all of the possible edge cases, even without that, I still think this is a very good starting point, and I think this topic is very much a conversation worth having. Now, since I am actually European, I did go ahead and sign the form. If you are also European, then definitely go check out the official proposal page, and if you do feel this is a conversation worth having, then definitely go ahead and sign up. They are currently 20% away to 1 million signatures, and you can see all the countries and how many people have voted for it. Alright, I hope you found it valuable to hear my thoughts on this topic. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.